Yeah, no. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us early this morning. I'm Mathias Huter. I'm the Managing Director of the UNCAC Coalition. We are a global network of more than 350 civil society organizations working to advance the monitoring and implementation of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption and advancing the anti-corruption agenda globally on the basis of the UNCAC. Okay, thank you. Welcome everybody. In this session, we would like to discuss the role of reviews and review mechanisms of anti-corruption conventions, of anti-corruption mechanisms, and how these reviews can play a role in advancing implementation, in advancing enforcement, in raising the bar, and in making sure that states implement on the national level what they have committed to. So we will look at different aspects of different review mechanisms, for example, at the level of transparency, of the level of inclusiveness. We will look at what role can civil society play in different mechanisms, and what are specific aspects of mechanisms that we think or you think can contribute to actual compliance. Why are we having this discussion right now? Well, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, which is the only global binding anti-corruption treaty that we have, its review, the first phase of its review mechanism is coming slowly to an end in 2024 or 2025. And so now states are discussing over the next year or 2 years how the future of the UNCAC review mechanism could look like and should look like. And so we would like this session to identify aspects, features of other reviews that we could lift and use to strengthen the UNCAC reviews. So let me introduce our panelists for this session. Next to me is Gillian Dell. She is the head of conventions and global advocacy lead at the Transparency International Secretariat, and she's also co-chair of the UNCAC coalition and has been involved in the UNCAC coalition since its very beginning about two decades ago. Next to her is Andres Hernandez. He's the executive director of Transparency International Colombia. Next to me is my colleague Corinna Gilfillan. She's a senior analyst with the UNCAC coalition based here in DC. And to her right is Tinatin Ninua, the deputy director of the Open Government Partnerships Independent Reporting Mechanism. Thank you all for joining us. We would really like this to be an interactive session after initial presentation, so please feel free to then come in with your comments, your own observations about different review mechanisms, your experiences, your questions to the panelists, so we can really learn from each other here and collect different experiences. And yeah, so I would like to get started with my colleague Corinna, who will tell us a little bit more about the UNCAC review mechanism and some of the challenges we have been observing in that context.
Everyone can hear me? Thank you very much, Mathias. I'd just like to start with why we should care about the UNCAC implementation review mechanism. And why we should care is because the UNCAC is the most comprehensive, legally binding anti-corruption treaty in the world. 188 states parties or governments that are part of it. And it covers such a vast range of anti-corruption measures, whether you're talking about corruption prevention, asset recovery, international cooperation, and law enforcement. So from our point of view, it can be or should be an important lever for holding governments to account for their anti-corruption commitments and obligations under the UNCAC, and also for fostering civil society participation and engagement in a meaningful way in anti-corruption efforts. However, what we've been finding, and the UNCAC Coalition has been involved in this right from the beginning, including actually Gillian, you were involved in that, right, in 2010 when it was launched, trying to make it as meaningful as possible. And we've found some very significant weaknesses that are hindering its ability to really achieve the goals of holding governments to account. So I was just going to go over some of the weaknesses, just to give you a brief overview of how it works. It's a peer review mechanism, so you have other governments that go and review. They select peer reviewers that go to the country to do a review. Generally, those reviews in the vast majority of cases are done through a country visit, where they need to evaluate how a country's system is on the relevant chapters of the UNCAC implementation, and then provide a report, an executive summary and a report that outlines their observations, identifies any good practices and recommendations for improvement. Now, as part of that, the review mechanism, what I'll do is I'd say the review mechanism is not very clear on how to engage civil society organizations. So they encourage civil society organizations, basically, that the government should consult civil society, for example, in the review visit and in the development of a self-assessment checklist that the government prepares under UNCAC implementation. But it's not very clear, and it's not consistent. So that's a major deficiency that we found in the process, this lack of inclusiveness of the process of engagement of civil society. And if you look at other mechanisms, you see more consistency, a systematic, at least, engagement of civil society. Furthermore, what you see if you look at the country reports from the mechanism, or the executive summaries in the country reports, you don't see consistency as far as documenting civil society engagement in the process. The other key deficiency that we're seeing is a lack of meaningful transparency. So as I said, basically what happens is after the review is done, they put together a country report and executive summary. And the executive summary is automatically put up online, but it's very short. It's 12 to 13 pages, and the real meat of what they find is in the country report. And that is actually not required to be published. A country could voluntarily decide to publish the report, but you're not required to do so. And as a result, that has not led to adequate transparency of these key country reports. For the first, and I should just say there have been two different review cycles for the IRM. So there was a first cycle that was launched at the very beginning and ended in 2015, and that review cycle looked at two different chapters of the UNCAC IRM. So that review cycle has been completed, and we're now in the second review cycle, which is looking at the asset recovery and preventive measures. But with the second cycle, the first cycle, which is nearly done, you have only a little bit over 50% of those country reports that are put online. So those countries have agreed to put the reports online, but then you have almost half of them that still haven't been put online. So the lack of transparency is a major deficiency, of the key documents from the review to enable civil society and other stakeholders to really use that comprehensive information that's sometimes in those reports. The other challenge is even on the country review process itself, there's not basic information like timelines for the key stages of the process, when the review visits will happen. That's generally not announced in advance, so it's very hard if the government isn't making an effort to include civil society. It makes it very difficult for civil society to get engaged. And I think that's different from other anti-corruption monitoring mechanisms, where generally there is at least some information and sometimes comprehensive information about the calendar for these kind of review visits. So to us, that's another real obstacle to transparency in the process and engaging civil society. A third major deficiency, and I should add on transparency, it's not just about at the country level, it's also at the international level. The UNCAC has subsidiary bodies. One of those is the Implementation Review Group, which oversees the IRM. And we, civil society and other non-governmental stakeholders, are not allowed to participate in those meetings, even as observers. We're just not allowed in the room. And so we think that that's a big hindrance as well to our participation and being able to meaningful contribute to the process and know what's going on. And then just another a key deficiency is a lack of a clear follow-up process. Unlike what you see in some other anti-corruption monitoring mechanisms, there's no clear official follow-up procedure to assess how countries are implementing the recommendations that have been made in country reviews, and also no transparency around that process, because we think that it would be very important to involve civil society organizations in the follow-up efforts as well. So, for example, in the second cycle of reviews that's now ongoing, that's going to be completed, supposed to be completed by 2024. There's a lot of delays. There are only 2 countries that have published the actions they've taken to follow up on the recommendations in their country review. So finally, I'd just like to focus on what the UNCAC Coalition is doing to promote civil society participation in the UNCAC. We're not just sitting on the sidelines. We're proactively really trying to get engaged despite these obstacles. One project that we have is, our initiative is basically providing support to civil society organizations to help them do civil society parallel reports, where they can basically identify the challenges, the good practices in their country, and put forward recommendations, and then use those country reports to influence the review process, and also follow up on the recommendations. And then we also have a transparency pledge, and this is where it outlines minimum standards for transparency and civil society engagement at all key stages of the review process. And we've got governments, we call on governments to sign on to this transparency pledge, and we have 33 countries that have signed on, and of course we're hoping for more engagement from other countries. And just to say also that we have an access to information campaign that we've launched, where civil society organizations can file freedom of information requests to try and get these documents, like the country reports, that are not automatically published, if their government is not doing so. So those are just some of the initiatives that we have, and please do ask questions or talk to us more if you're interested with any of them, but I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Corinna. Our next speaker is Gillian Dell of Transparency International, who will talk about a review mechanism that is maybe less known but has some interesting features. Gillian, please.
Thanks, Matthias. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk about the OECD Istanbul Action Plan, which is a program of peer reviews for 10 countries in mostly in Central Asia, actually, but running from Armenia to Uzbekistan, and in between Georgia and Ukraine, and the Russian Federation used to be a member until they joined the OECD Working Group on Bribery. Now, I know much better the OECD Working Group on Bribery system of peer reviews. As a matter of fact, the OECD has a kind of standard system of peer reviews within the organization for different standards and instruments. But the Istanbul Action Plan adds to that. So what's standard is there's a self-assessment questionnaire, country visits, a report is drafted, there's a plenary discussion, and I want to highlight that because that is something missing from the UNCAC review process, and it's very important. And in fact, it's not so well known that, in the UNCAC review process, only the countries that peer review the country under review actually see the country reports in full, unless the country reviewed decides to make them public. This is incredible, So that's missing from the UNCAC process. Then they have a sort of agreement of how they approach it, which is that there should be consensus and equal treatment on the final report. There is a final report, and it's published shortly after it's decided in plenary. There's a press release about it, and there is, in all cases, a follow-up process. So these are elements in the standard OECD process, but how does the Istanbul Action Plan enhance that? Just to say that the way the Istanbul Action Plan peer review process works is they develop a questionnaire based on international standards. And the UNCAC, since their third, I think it's since their third round of peer reviews, they've been using UNCAC as a basis for their reviews. And the pillars of the Istanbul Action Plan cover anti-corruption policy, criminalization, and prevention of corruption. They have finished 4 rounds already, and they are, which in the recent ones focus on practical implementation. That's also an important difference so far from the UNCAC process, which largely focuses on on implementation into legal frameworks, although there are some elements of practical implementation in there. And there is a steering group and a secretariat. Now, I want to highlight some of the aspects of the Istanbul Action Plan that are better than the, far better than the UNCAC review process. Now, one of them is that in fact, NGOs, private sector, and other stakeholders are invited to provide responses to the questionnaire as an official part of the process. So that's a big difference. I mean, UNCAC Coalition helps NGOs to prepare parallel reports, but they are not considered an official part of the process. And also NGOs and et cetera are given the opportunity to comment on the draft report that is being prepared. So that's, they're taking civil society quite seriously there. They are also welcome to prepare alternative reports, which will, again, be officially considered as part of the process. And then, in terms of oral inputs and exchanges at the stages of the process where that's possible, there are on-site visits, and interesting difference from the UNCAC process. The secretariat, the OECD secretariat, organizes the civil society panel at that meeting, at that visit, different from the UNCAC where the country actually decides who may speak at the meeting. The panel decides that, and the government is not invited to attend those meetings. This is obviously very important in countries where civil society may be under threat from their own government if they speak critically about what the government is doing. So these are important differences. Now, also, as I mentioned, there are these plenary meetings where all the countries discuss the draft report. And incredibly enough, and this is actually the only review process I know of except for the human rights processes in Geneva, but in the anti-corruption review processes, civil society may attend those plenary meetings where the draft report is discussed. And they may also participate in bilateral discussions about how the final draft of the report should look, if the country in question agrees to that. I mean, that's quite an advanced stage of participation, but it is done. I've been at meetings where that was done. So what we see here is that we have 10 countries which are, not, I don't know, some of them may not be invited to, the Summit for Democracy or whatever, but 10 countries which have agreed to this process. And in fact, at a certain point, Russia had agreed to this process. So apparently it's possible, it's doable, it's politically feasible to have these types of elements in the process. Of course, as part of the process, there is also a follow-up. There's a draft report with detailed recommendations. There's a report on Georgia that's out very recently, which is about 136 pages. You know, they're quite detailed and comprehensive. And the follow-up results in compliance ratings, a bit like the FATF process. I mean, they haven't even started follow-up with the UNCAC process, so we have no idea how it will be conducted. But I'm sure there would be a big fight about having compliance ratings. They are, so they have fully compliant, largely compliant, partially compliant, and not compliant. That relates to the recommendations that are made in the report. And at each meeting of this anti-corruption network, countries must report on their progress in implementing the recommendations fully. And civil society can contribute to follow-up reports. So I think there are a lot of features in this process which we could learn from to improve the UNCAC review process in the next round. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Gillian. Certainly lots of interesting features that would be great to scale to the UNCAC review mechanism and maybe other mechanisms. So next we would like to look at a very different approach at how the Open Government Partnership looks at its independent reporting mechanism. And yeah, Tina, I give you the floor.
Great, thanks, Matthias. Before I start talking about the review mechanism, probably there are some people in the audience who might not know much about OGP, so I'll say that the partnership was founded in 2011 on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, and currently we have 77 national governments who are members and over 100 local governments. The way OGP works is that it's very much a partnership between government and civil society. We have 50% representation government and 50% representation civil society on the steering committee of the partnership. And the idea is to encourage governments to make commitments that will open up government, fight corruption, and use technologies and citizen participation to address some of the most salient governance challenges. In terms of the independent reporting mechanism, this was inbuilt into the partnership from the very beginning, from the founding of it, to make sure that the commitments that countries would make would not be just left on shelf, or that the partnership would not become a talk shop, so to say. So we assess participation, performance of OGP participating governments. And we do that by looking at the action plans and specific commitments they make. So every government in the partnership puts forward an action plan, which is usually 2 years long, could be a bit longer as well. And they make specific commitments. It's up to the country to decide what kind of commitments they co-create together with civil society and put in the plan. And then we assess to what extent these commitments are ambitious, to what extent they're going to produce results that are going to change policies and government practices. And then once the action plan is completed, we look to what extent these commitments have been implemented, whether governments delivered on what they said they would do. And also we try to assess early results of these commitments, whether we do see any changes in existing policies or government practices, and whether these actually stretch the existing practices and businesses as usual. So in terms of how we are set up, I think we have quite a lot of similarities with the UNCAC review mechanism and the OECD ACN1 Gillian described, but we also have some features that make this mechanism very different. So similar to the review mechanism, we are also we have our own kind of like review group. So to say, the governance structure is such that we are governed by the International Experts Panel, which currently consists of 5 members. These are independent experts who have either thematic or regional expertise, and they approve our method, and they basically are reviewing our outputs. Also, we do consult a lot with the governments. This is also very similar to other mechanisms, but different from the UNCAC review mechanism. We have a very participatory approach in how the reports are produced, and also when it comes to the transparency of what we produce. So during the assessment, we consult extensively with the representatives of those government agencies that have commitments in the action plan. We also extensively consult with the civil society. This is done through individual interviews, but also through organized focus groups, etc. And one thing that we also try to do a lot is that to go beyond just usual suspects and to see to also consult with the individuals or organizations who would be benefiting from the implementation of these commitments. And sometimes they are particular institutions like educational institutions, for example, or organizations of people who have special needs, etc. And we do that through field research. Some of our researchers would, for example, use freedom of information requests to see whether the new practices or new laws that are being instituted are actually working in practice. So that's an interesting element that we have done in some countries, particularly in Spain, for example, or Slovakia. Then the next part is that once we produce the draft report, we send it to the government and key civil society organizations that are part of the process for a 21 calendar day pre-publication review. So this is an opportunity for the governments and for participating NGOs to provide feedback on the report, because we might have missed something or there might be some errors, so we give them a chance to point this out, and then we take these comments into consideration. Once we incorporate this feedback, we put out a report which is a public comments version, which is then posted on the website, and anyone can comment on it. And we have a 2-week public commenting period when any NGO, any member of the public can comment on anything on the report. And actually the format in which we post it is civic comments. Some of you might be familiar with it. So people can provide feedback on specific parts of the report, specific sentences or parts where they can comment exactly like, I don't agree with this, or I have additional information, etc. And then all our reports are public. They're posted on the website. Once they're posted, our website also has a commenting function, so we do encourage people to go into them and give additional comments at any point of time. So by now, since the founding of the partnership, we have assessed over 5,000 commitments from more than 160 action plans. Obviously, some countries have gone through several rounds of these action plans, and now we have some countries that are implementing their 5th or the 6th OGP action plan. But one thing that I also want to mention is that these assessments also provide very good material for us to provide very targeted recommendations on what should be improved. So every time we do an assessment, we also come up with a set of recommendations that help the countries improve the next process.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tinatin, for highlighting how the Open Government Partnership assesses the review of the national action plans. Our last speaker will provide the perspective of a national NGO and how, from the national level, TI Colombia engages or chooses not to engage, or to what level they choose to engage in different reviews. Andres, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Mathias, and thank you to the UNCAC Coalition for the invitation to speak in this panel. As Mathias just mentioned, I would like to change maybe a bit the perspective of the conversation and put us in a place about what civil society organizations do when we have a lot of these international commitments to follow up and how to drive change based on these commitments. I would like to make a quick review around 3 issues. First, around what is it that we monitor and which are the key lessons around that. Second, around how to do the monitor. how to do the follow-up of these international commitments. And third, I want to end by talking a few points related to the accountability and the reactions and the effects that these follow-up reports produce at country level. So about the what to monitor. When we are at the national level, and I believe perhaps some of you also come from NGOs at national level, you have all this set of commitments. You have the UNCAC in the Americas, we have the OAS conventions, we have the Summit of the Americas, anti-corruption commitments, but in Colombia, we also are part of the OECD anti-bribery convention, and we also have to follow up, for example, the Financial Action Task Force recommendations on money laundering, etc. So sometimes this seems to be a lot of commitments and issues to follow up. And even though national efforts are very much supported by these international instruments, and I will always defend the need for having these international commitments, sometimes with all these areas to cover and all these commitments to cover, you might get lost. And the first lesson that I want to share with you is the importance of not only looking at the follow-up of each of these instruments in a single manner, but try to have a wider focus and wider scope on how to put them together in a single strategy. When you actually want to promote, let's take, for example, access to information or whistleblowing protection, which is two big issues in Colombia, having this wide scope, it's very important, and then you can actually make use of the different tools and follow-up mechanisms to promote advocacy at national level. So that's one of the first practices, lessons that I wanted to share, having this wide scope so that national level change can be driven. Then when we talk about how to monitor, a few lessons as well. The first one is interesting to see how we started monitoring these international conventions in the late 90s, in the early 2000s, perhaps from a very technical point of view. And we were kind of think tanks trying to assess with very technical data that the countries were achieving or not the commitments of the international conventions. But what has happened in recent years is that there's a lot of need to involve much more civil society organizations. We need larger coalitions, we need larger platforms, so this follow-up can have a stronger voice and we can increase the chances of achieving impact. This is, for example, something that we have tried to do in the framework of the Citizen Corruption Observatory that follow-ups international commitments made by countries in the Americas. And here, for example, we have involved a lot of organizations working on gender issues, and this has allowed us to, as I mentioned before, open up the scope of involving other perspectives, other organizations, and having them as well pushing for better implementation, and not only as the anti-corruption organization trying to do a work that may be sometimes a bit difficult to do by our own. The other point around how to monitor these international commitments and conventions is around the very basic input that we always need, which is information. And trying to prepare this report, trying to prepare these follow-up reporting mechanisms sets the challenge around the access to information to properly follow up, and the quality of data that you actually manage to use to prepare these reports. And here, for example, we had a lot of problems in recent years, of course, with the pandemic. A lot of the access to information mechanisms suffered a lot, and this is where we had to start working much more with other sources of information, trying to bring together, as it has been mentioned already, the interviews and groups interviews with many other organizations, so we can increase the amount and the quality of data that we can have. And the other lesson is also trying to do a lot of use of the public data, but it happens that sometimes this data is not good enough. So there's a lot of work to do around cleaning that data and transforming that into a specific and strong arguments that we could use in terms of assessing if countries are complying or not with these conventions. And I want to end very quick with the issue of accountability. What happens with all these commitments at the country level? Because many of them have been there for years, and sometimes when countries don't comply, nothing happens. So here I want to touch on 2 points. The transparency, which has been mentioned already, about the reports. The case of UNCAC, for me, there's no argument for this information not to be open to the public. Most of the other instruments already publish the reports, have a lot of citizen participation, and this is almost by default. So I don't see why UNCAC still has this, for me, very low standard in terms of actually releasing this information and discuss it publicly. And I want to end with the effects of that follow-up. As I mentioned, when countries don't comply with these commitments, there are no sanctions, there are no effects in many of these instruments. But it calls my attention what happens, for example, with the working group on bribery from the OECD, or what happens, for example, when following up on the Financial Action Task Force commitments. I see countries, at least in Colombia, putting much more attention into the compliance of those mechanisms compared to what happens to UNCAC or compared to what happens with the Inter-American Convention. So we need to assess and identify why those other instruments are working and why it's not the same case for the rest of the commitments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andres, for providing us with the national perspective and also reflecting on how can we actually get countries to really act on the recommendations and the follow-up. So thank you for that. I would now like to open the floor to any comments, questions, observations you would like to share. Yes, I think, will there be a microphone? There's a microphone here, but maybe we can also hand one around. But yeah, thank you. If you could use that microphone so the online audience can also follow. Thank you. And please briefly introduce yourself as well.
Good morning. My name is Matt Aubrey. I'm the Executive Director of the Organization for Responsible Governance in the Bahamas. We work on accountable governance and anti-corruption work, really trying to address long-term issues. And so, Andres, I really appreciate your perspective, talking about where's the teeth in this process. And I think being reactive as a civil society organization is kind of in the nature. Something happens and you have to follow up on it. So I guess my comment would be, I mean, and related to the OGP, we have great aspirations to be an OGP country. But once countries have made those levels of commitment to be considered as an OGP, they're almost in that space already. Those that sign on to the Inter-American or the UNCAC, they aren't required to have those levels of achievement in order to sign on. They just can sign on. It's not that simple, obviously. So then my thought is, we know that in program development, having civil society involvement at the formative stage, meaningful involvement, is critical to having integrity in the process and building trust. What levels of commitment or what opportunities could there be in requiring civil society, local civil society involvement in the actual development of the committees that are generating those reports, and then thinking about how to prepare us as those effective monitors, whether it be gatherers of data or doing that. I mean, and beyond just technical support, I think there's a need for resources too.
Thank you very much. Maybe we collect one or two more questions or statements, if there are any at this point. Yes, if you could just, and then the lady. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to appreciate the conversation. I'm Benson Turamye. I come from Uganda. I want, first of all, to register what we are sharing. And these government commitments, for example, in developing countries, tend to focus governance, whereas our interest at times is service delivery to our citizens. I work with a procurement regulatory body of government, so I'm from government side. And what has been really a challenge is disclosure, the transparency she was talking about. And what areas are we talking about in the whole functionality of government? Because like us in procurement, we are saying disclose all contracts. But if you go to assets, for example, assets declaration, there is nothing like that. The asset declaration of government civil servants is between the civil servant and the ombudsman. What about if we talk about those government issues? How does civil society come in, understand those commitments? They are not known. They are not known. So civil society organizations that exist may not even understand what to focus on. So I think there is need for disclosure, first of all, and then reporting mechanism. The moment you seem to be a civil society who is working in isolation without the government, then the government will always be suspicious on what you are going to report. So there is need for openness and inclusion. I thank you.
Thank you very much for this case for disclosure. I think there's more and more countries that publish, for example, asset declaration, but I think your point is extremely important, that often civil society cannot monitor. There was one more intervention, then I'm happy to
Thanks. Hi, I'm Lou Ecclestone. Hi, everyone. I don't know quite where to stand. From the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office in the UK. Thank you so much for organising this session. I think it's really helpful to underline what an outlier the IRM is compared to the ones that we've heard about and then some other ones that are there. I think we're really supportive of efforts to try and make the process more transparent, try and head towards transparency by default, as our colleague from Colombia said. It'd be interesting to hear more from the panel about sort of concrete actions that you'd like to see. And I think we would fully support more civil society engagement in the process, more information about the review process as it's going on, publication of full reports rather than just executive summaries. But I think if there are any more actions that you would like to see. I also have a question, and this is my ignorance about how the UNCAC process works. I don't work on it directly, which is presumably countries can do this now if they want to. There's nothing to stop them publishing their reports. I know we were very appreciative of civil society contributions when the UK last had its peer review process, and I think that helped to move the process along and come up with a better report. So, yeah, I don't know if you have a sort of, not quite a target list, but a group of countries where you know they're willing to make process. You mentioned the Transparency Pledge, and sort of start collating good practice that you already see, as well as how you'd like to see others join. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. So I would like to give the panel an opportunity to respond to these comments and questions. Who wants to start?
Well, thank you. Let me try to cover a few of these points. Sorry if I cannot answer to all of them. Maybe I will start with the last question, which areas or actions could be supported for civil society to keep an active participation. I think today any action that could be done in terms of increasing and ensuring civil society participation in these follow-up commitments is extremely welcome. And I say this largely due to the context that we face, perhaps at global level, but also at regional level, in terms of the shrinking of civic space. And that's a major challenge in general for democracies today. So as I mentioned, very basic key action is supporting as much as we can the voice of civil society and how this can be, not in terms of confronting the state, but having enough information to assess actually how countries are performing. This is not about having countries rating bad in this or that mechanism. This is about how to ensure that countries use these anti-corruption tools and actions to actually have wider impact. This is perhaps my second comment, is that we shouldn't miss the aim of all these processes. At the end, we want better democracies, we want better quality of life, we want respect for human rights. And this has to be at as the main goal of all these efforts. So keeping that in mind, for me, it's very important. And third, being more specific about the mechanisms. I want to compare what we have experienced in terms of the monitoring of UNCAC convention, for example, with what happens, again, with the working group on bribery. When we are invited during the country visits, for example, for the UNCAC review, we are invited with perhaps 5 more organizations to a 1-hour session in which the government is not there, is not present, but we have to split the time, and you have like maybe 10 minutes to speak, and everybody want to provide their input. And we have no comments from the peer countries visiting. They just want to hear, and we don't know at the end if this is working or not. Compared to, again, what we have experienced with the working group of bribery. We have an open and very clear conversation with the members of the review mechanism, and we managed to see, as Gillian mentioned, the reports once they are released. The quality of the participation in that, of civil society participation in that follow-up mechanism is much more efficient and much more open than what we have today in terms of the UNCAC follow-up mechanism. So my point around this, and I end with this, is that actually continue promoting these open mechanisms, this effective participation from civil society is very important, again, so we can assess if we are in the right track.
Thank you very much. Gillian, did you want to respond?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I will also respond to that last question and kind of what our wish list would be. I think a lot of the elements I've talked about in the Istanbul Action Plan would be on our wish list. And as always, the question is what's politically feasible. Again, we see that there are 10 countries which have agreed to that. Actually, the standards are beyond what the OECD Working Group on Bribery itself, which involves OECD members, have agreed to. So that's also an interesting question to find out why that is. While we would like all those elements, we know that there have been, debates and discussions about that. And one thing we have to take into account in this context, and I don't think the arguments were raised for whatever reason, that we're actually talking here about human rights standards. Human rights standards about access to information, about civil society participation in public affairs, and that it's very dangerous that the UN is basically agreeing to lowering those standards in the context of UNCAC reviews, which are supposed to be against corruption and opaque transactions, and that rather than insisting upon agreed human rights standards. So I think one thing that might be done is to do, by countries that are interested in improving the mechanism, is to refer a little more to the fact that these are not optional. These are the default position. There has to be a reason why there would not be transparency and inclusion. And another thing which we haven't discussed at all, but I'm wondering about, is whether there might be a possibility for countries that are really committed to high standards to add those standards to their reviews. And I mean, it's a bit along the lines of the UNCAC transparency pledge, but maybe it would be actually going beyond that, because we were quite modest when we developed that pledge. So there would be basically 2 types of reviews going on, but that should be made very public, because the issues are very serious to do with civil society space and transparency, and a real commitment to anti-corruption. That is the real issue.
Thank you, Gillian. Corinna, did you have a reaction?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I would just say that to respond to the question about what can governments do, on their own. I mean, there's a lot that governments can do, just building on Gillian's point. On the transparency side, there's a country profile page, and there's the own government's websites, and you can put up, obviously, publish your country report, as we've been saying, the self-assessment checklist, a timeline for your country review, when you expect all the key stages of the review to happen, announcing when the review visit will happen well in advance, as well as, when the country review happens, you could post submissions from civil society organizations, other non-governmental organizations. That could go on the UNODC website as well. I mean, I think a country can request that. So that would be a way for countries to do it, to do it now, along with our transparency pledge, as we had highlighted. And then as far as meaningful civil society engagement, Gillian's already highlighted some really good practices, as well as what we see from OGP, of civil society being partners in the process, not an afterthought of, we're going to do a 1-hour meeting. And I think we're seeing some examples of that. One example recently was basically a country that has set up a committee where the civil society organizations are part of the committee to basically decide a plan for following up the recommendations in the country visit, in the country report. So, that's in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So that's one example. In other cases, countries have they've had the civil society organizations that did the civil society report, the parallel report, do presentations to the peer review mechanism. And another idea would be, if you look at the MESASIC, the Organization of American States, their conventions review, civil society can make presentations before the working group that oversees their review mechanism. And so why can't the implementation review group have civil society give presentations about the review process or specific countries in advance of their reviews? These are things that we could do, that we could start doing, in addition to, as was mentioned before, advocating for some changes in the mechanism, particularly for the second phase, and having a transparent follow-up process that involves civil society.
Thank you, Corinna. Tina Tin.
Yeah, I think in OGP we are a bit privileged in the sense that the need for civil society participation and transparency is just not doubted at all. It's a given because, the reason for this is what the gentleman from Bahamas also mentioned, is that we are a voluntary partnership, but countries have to satisfy eligibility criteria to become members of OGP. So those 77 governments that are in OGP already have some basic transparency rules in place, and these rules have to do with civil liberties, fiscal transparency, access to information, and access to asset declarations. Actually, these are the 4 criteria. So in that sense, it never comes up like whether our report should be disclosed or whether civil society it needs to participate. However, one thing I want to mention is that we were talking about disclosure, and it's, of course, extremely important that we encourage more disclosure. There are governments in OGP that collect information about, for example, asset declarations, but not all of them make it public. So that's one of the things where we encourage them. Every information government collects and where taxpayer money is spent on collecting and storing information, it should be made public. And one thing I want to say also is that what we have seen is that disclosure alone is not enough. Disclosure is a starting point and necessary, but it doesn't mean that if you have disclosure, you have accountability, and that's where the role of civil society comes in. And civil society needs resources to exercise accountability and to really be able to use the data that's disclosed. And the government needs to make sure that the data is disclosed in a way that is usable by civil society. It's not hidden in some kind of dubious PDF documents or whatever, but it's actually open data and usable and reusable, so that actually civil society can use limited resources it has to maximize the impact in terms of accountability.
Thank you very much, Tina Tin. more questions, comments? Yes, please. We'll start here. Okay.
Good morning. Irina Lonan, Transparency International Romania. In the last month, I had interesting experiences related to review processes. In Romania, we had in November a visit for the UNCAC review and the visit from Greco for the review of the Council of Europe conventions. They met with the civil society. At the meeting with Greco, we were 3 people. In the meeting for the UNCAC review, we were 2 people. The bottom line was that civil society in Romania, although it has an interest for anti-corruption, it doesn't have enough capacity. And capacity goes 2 ways, in my view. The first, it's the capacity to understand and to give feedback in a process that it's pretty complex. It's not just the basic elements of transparency or the basic elements of criminalizing bribery. It's looking into the complex situations that actually in a footnote to recommendations are doing things working or not in the country. This is one thing. And the second thing is that although there are more than 3 organizations in Romania that have this capacity, they don't have time. And they don't have time because, and I don't think it's only happening in Romania, many civil society organizations work project-based. They don't have funding for core activities like this because the review processes are not planned enough in advance. We cannot access funding in order to have an expert that will follow up on the reviews and so on. So the question for you is if there are mechanisms in place to support civil society organizations in order to participate, both with knowledge, but also with some support to allow them to have the time to participate. Because otherwise, it is great to have the transparency. We don't have it enough in Romania, but it would be great to have the transparency, but it's not enough. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. There was a gentleman here and then 2 in the back afterwards. Thank you.
Yes, hello, good morning. My name is Hadi Fink. I'm with the Partnership for Transparency. So we're talking here about how to involve civil society in UNCAC implementation review and in the OGP. But, and we're talking about what can governments do to involve them. And I think that's very important because I think there's a fundamental lack of civil society and governments talking to each other. And it seems that CSOs are not part of the IRG, but it seems to me also that governments are not part of the IACC. I think when we talk about how CSOs can participate in the IRG and in the working groups, we could also talk about how to get governments to participate in a forum like this, to get us talking to each other. And I think that's an idea that we want to get them here, we start talking to each other, and we start building trust, and then we can also talk about how it goes the other way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In the back, I don't know if we have another microphone that is... Could you maybe come to the microphone here? Sorry. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Paola Organ. I head a USAID-funded project in Peru on public investment, transparent public investment. We work at the subnational level, and we have a very systemic approach to introducing transparency, accountability, and public investment and procurement. My specific question was related to measurement. I think accountability is one of the there's several proposals out there as to how to measure, of course, accountability. Probably the hardest part of it, from the supply side, transparency, openness is maybe somewhat easier, whereas creating actually agency on the civil society, the capacity of civil society to not only just engage but to be able to influence decision makers. So I know there's several proposals out there in terms of how to do it, but specifically what I wanted to know is if you have anyone has any concrete experience on how you're measuring whether or not there is more accountability and civil society and stakeholders are having more agency. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
Thank you for holding this panel, and good morning. My name is Chelsea Dreher. I work with the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. Our project is really focused on meeting international corruption standards from UNCAC, from GRECO, from OGP action plans, from all of these mechanisms that we've been talking today. I just wanted to note that our partners, I think Mr. Hernandez, you captured this wonderfully, all have different focuses and are trying to synthesize all of the recommendations coming from all of these mechanisms to decide where to work. And so it can be really overwhelming when they're trying to consult on all of these different mechanisms. What we found to be really useful is to talk to them about where they not only see urgency for reform, but also where they see political will and opportunity for reform. So we take that sort of dual lens, and what you said about some mechanisms having more teeth and more attention than others, CSOs have amazing insights on why that is. For instance, our EU partners are looking at UNCAC, they're looking at OGP, but our partners in states that are hoping to accede to the EU are looking at those EU rule of law reports. So talking to civil society organizations, not only about what changes they want to see and your specific mechanisms, I think, but also which mechanisms carry more weight for them and why is a really valuable thing. I also just wanted to add that our civil society partners really want to be engaged in the UNCAC review process in all of these consultations, but they're also facing a lot of challenges in terms of closing space. Some of them have been blacklisted from the COSP, for example, for false allegations about engagement with a terrorist group around the world that they've never had a connection with. Or some of them are facing some pretty predatory Foreign Registration Act legislation that could ban them from operating, or at least make it very difficult for them to have a voice at the national level, let alone in some of these international mechanisms. So I think having a consultation with civil society organizations, not only about what contributions they can make to these processes, but also about the other challenges that they're having more holistically that could prevent them from engaging, would be really excellent. So thank you for the time in the panel.
Thank you very much. Maybe we do two more, and then we come back to the panelists, and then we can do a final round of interventions. Maybe we go with Mirella now from UNODC. Maybe you can also respond to some of the questions that were highlighted.
Thank you, and yes, good morning to everybody. I'm Mirella, heading the Civil Society Unit in UNODC. I will start with a question, but not to the panel, to the people. Who has read 3 full report of UNCAC? 1, 2, 3. Okay, 6 people. So this is to echo what the representative from the civil society in Romania said. It's already difficult to read the summary of the UNCAC. So I know that one of the plea has been always the full report, but the full report, very few will read it, very few. And here is an example of where you have a lot of people who are specialized on the issue of anti-corruption and read only 3 full report. And also, I want to respond to some of the question. Why the report is of course a prerogative of the state, but again, a report to be published, you need also to translate it very often and in the UN 6 language, and this is it's time consuming, and this is one of the reasons there is always delays. And now another comment probably in favor of UNCAC is that one of the teeth that the other mechanisms don't have is really the asset recovery. I mean, Chapter 2, you are all aware that the money don't hide among the friends or in the region, it hides outside, and to be able to reach out and trace this money, you need really this chapter, which is unique, and for this, because 189 states are party of this convention. And I know that you all know about that, because, but also to respond to how to increase the capacity of civil society, we have been partnering with the UNCAC coalition since 2011 to exactly that, increase the capacity of civil society to understand and arrive equipped when the review of their country takes place. We have been partly successful because somehow the numbers kept on increasing about the percentage of of countries that have involved civil society. For the second cycle, we are at 95%, so that's not too bad. Of course, the cycle is not over. There's more work to do, and we look forward to continue this collaboration. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mirella. Should we do very quick reactions to some of the comments and questions, and then go back to the audience? Andres, I think you want to respond.
Yes. Maybe starting with some controversy from what Mirella just mentioned. I don't think the point is reading the whole report. I think the point is about, from the civil society perspective, that we find in the report the issues that are our top priorities. So if I work on access to information, I want to see the section of the report on access to information. Or if I work on whistleblowing protection, I want to see the section of the report on whistleblowing protection. The point is that we cannot leave up to the states to decide what is it that they want to disclose, because this is a state obligation, and it's mostly based on human rights standards, as Gillian mentioned. So from the civil society perspective, and this is what I tell colleagues from civil society organizations, some of them at local level, it's impossible that we become experts in criminal law, in money laundering, access to information, and again, whistleblowing protection. We need to choose our priorities. And based on those priorities is that we need to make the best use out of these international conventions. Again, perhaps we have different readings about the situations, but when you have, and I know Mirella knows this very well because you know a lot about civil society, and we've been working on this for many years. But when we have limited resources and limited capacities, my recommendation is always, let's pick our battles. Let's not try to change everything, and let's try to advocate based on our top priorities, which is my second reaction, mostly to our colleagues in Romania. My first answer will be join the UNCAC coalition if you are not part of the UNCAC coalition yet. Okay, great, you are. So because for us the basic or the key support that we receive, not only in terms of having some funding to conduct the parallel report, but also in terms of exchanging ideas, information, what works or not in different countries. That's very important to, again, identify our top priorities. And I end with this to try to answer also some of the question from the person from Peru. Again, let's have our priorities and our goals very clear. It's not the follow-up of these mechanisms is not the end by itself. It's a mean to achieve larger or wider goals. And in that sense, what we have introduced in the framework of the monitoring of the Summit of the Americas anti-corruption commitments is additional criteria so that our monitoring from civil society is a bit deeper, not only looking at the big gap that there's always between law and practices, but we are looking, for example, at the opportunity, at the relevance and the sustainability of the measures that governments are taking when they are reporting on the compliance of these mechanisms. For example, they may say that there's a new law. Okay, is that law based on resources? Is there capacity to implement it? Is it timely? I mean, do we need this law now, or is the law really well focused? Or if it's a public policy, okay, is that public policy really aiming at what it has to aim? Is that policy really sustainable from one government to the other? I mean, introducing those kind of criteria can also help a lot in terms of having more to say from the civil society perspective.
Thank you very much. Gillian, did you want to react?
Yeah, thanks. No, those are points I fully agree with. You also made another point, which was about civil society forming coalitions to deal with reviews, and for dealing with a number of reviews, looking at how to participate in a number of reviews at the same time. So I think that's also a good strategy. I mean, in terms of there being only 2 NGOs present from Romania, or 3 at the reviews, my reaction is that's surprising in the sense that there are there's potential for much more, even in the existing situation. There are academics out there. I'm sure there are academics in Romania who could have contributed. There are people from the private sector who I would think could have contributed. And just, by the way, the UNCAC coalition provides access to a network of pro bono lawyers who can help NGOs. Apart from, certainly the resource challenges are very serious, especially operating across multiple conventions, which is the case for some countries. But I think that there's more we could do to strengthen, as long as those involved feel like it's going to make a difference, that it's going to have impact. They feel like it's just some kind of formal exercise, a bit decorative. Yes, we involved civil society. Then nobody's going to want to spend the time and effort to do that, So I think it's what happens afterwards is very important to that situation. I just want to say also, Mirella mentioned these UNCAC trainings, which are done together with the UNCAC coalition, and I think they're really valuable. There are regular reviews of could they be better, how could they be improved. But I think over the years, and they've been going on for many years, they've proven them to be, very useful. But I think that there are also other ways, probably, of assisting civil society, apart from going to a meeting, perhaps online material as well. But again, the fundamental point is, and I just want to say about those meetings, in terms of the issue of meeting with governments, they're joint government, civil society, private sector meetings. So that's a very good approach as well. But again, the main issue is it going to make a difference?
Thank you, Gillian. Corinna, did you have a reaction?
Yes, on the issue raised about civic space and the challenges for civil society in countries where there is a shrinking civic space. I'd just like to say I think that there's more that the UNODC and others could do on that front, and I refer to the Special Rapporteur Mary Lawler's report on human rights defenders working on anti-corruption, which highlights the severe risks facing these defenders who in some cases are getting killed. And the report makes recommendations that the UNODC and other UN bodies should monitor the attacks on these human rights defenders working on anti-corruption, and also monitor what the UN and other bodies are doing to try to protect, or not the UN, I'm sorry, what government institutions are doing to try to protect defenders, what is being done. Because on the UNCAC, you have Article 13 protection of civil society, promotion of civil society, and anti-corruption efforts. So I do think that's one example where more could be done. And then there was just a question on measurement of accountability. I think that's a really good point. Our focus is on ensuring follow-up, and not just when you look at follow-up on whether recommendations from country review reports are adopted, also looking at what is the impact of those laws. What is the impact in curbing corruption, looking at the actual outcomes of laws and enforcement. And I think that OECD and others are trying to look at the enforcement, and other mechanisms are trying to look at the enforcement of measures as well, and the UNCAC country review process should do more at looking at enforcement and the outcomes of legal frameworks, how it's curbing corruption. Thanks.
Thank you, Corinna. Tina Tin.
Yeah, I would just like to reinforce the point Andres made about the reports and who reads them, etc. Because our reports also used to be quite long, like 150 pages sometimes. Now we try to make them shorter. So we've had many cases when people, not necessarily civil society, but academics, researchers have gotten back to us months and maybe even years later asking questions about something that was in the report. So it's really not about just reading the entire report, it's about having this information available out there. And once you publish them, you do see how many users there are.
Good point. Thank you, Tina Tin. So I would like to come back for a final round of comments and questions. Maybe we start with the gentleman here in the front, then we have 3 questions on this side. Please just make your way to the microphone. That would be easiest. Thank you.
Hi, Simon Taylor from Global Witness. I'm one of the co-founders. Sorry, does that work? That's better. Yeah. So I have an observation, and I guess it's an appeal to anyone in the room who might be able to do something about this. So I've been involved, I'm one of the complainants in Milan, in the US, in the UK, in the Netherlands, and in Nigeria for a series of complaints related to the corrupt deal for the OPL 245 oil block in Nigeria, which was acquired by Shell and Eni. They plus 15 other defendants were acquitted last year in March. There was an appeal mounted, which was basically hijacked. I won't go into the detail of this, but we believe the case was basically nobbled, and the result of the judgment, the preliminary court judgment, in our view, meant that Italy had fallen out of compliance with the OECD convention, and on the basis of that, and especially after the appeal collapsed, which had all sorts of weird things going on, which are extremely unsubtle, blatant, and kind of lethal to the prosecution, we wrote a complaint to the peer review process, the phase 4 peer review process, who pronounced in November. The US was one of the working group assessors, Germany the other one, and they were quite condemnatory of Italy, and they declared Italy has indeed, based on this judgment and 2 previous ones, fallen now out of compliance with the convention. Now, that's great. It's a formal record. I don't know what you would call it, I suppose, a no confidence vote in what happened. And I hasten to add, this is not, in my view, to do with the prosecutors. This is to do with inappropriate access behind the scenes. Anyway, it's a complex matter, and we'll be talking about this on Saturday in a panel. But my appeal is how, and I'd love people's views, how can we move from that, which is great, and a historical record when published of what happened, and an assessment by people in a position to make such an assessment, to live interaction when matters are getting underhand. And the reason I relate to that issue is that during the course of the effort to prevent the appeal going forward, an attack was mounted, and that's the only way I can describe it, on the 2 prosecutors who ran the case. There are unbelievable questions of credibility to this attack, and we believe that the purpose of that attack was to discredit them so they could not run the appeal. The result was a different prosecutor who came in who didn't even contest it and disclosed that this whole thing was some kind of neo-colonial attack. It was against Nigeria's democracy, even though in fact Nigeria is prosecuting the case and was a cooperative witness and had supplied information and all the rest of it, and had publicly declared this whole case to be corrupt. The result is we now have 2 prosecutors, one of whom was the man who convicted Berlusconi. So these are not just any old prosecutors. This is about, you go after the crown jewels, this is what happens to you. And I know, because of our contacts, that some members of the working group were hopping up and down ballistic furious at what was going on and demanding an intervention. But because of the consensus approach to the working group, it was blocked. The result was we watched a train crash happen in broad daylight that everyone can see what it is, and now we've got a problem. I think it amounts to an attempt to defrock the entire anti-corruption effort in the Milan Public Prosecutor's Office, which, given it's the preemptive fight in Italy, is based there. That's a really serious international problem. So that's my appeal. How can we make the working group or other mechanisms proactive when something so blatant is underway? Thank you.
Thank you very much. You certainly also teased your session on Saturday. So very interesting case. Yeah, very interesting case, certainly. Yes, please.
Hi, Chris Wirtz, United States Office of Government Ethics, and of course, only speaking on my behalf here. My question deals with context and narrative. These are oftentimes fairly long reports. The self-assessment checklists can rival the old man in the sea. And so the question I always think is, transparency to be actionable has to be digestible. How do you take the information in these reports? Are there methods, are there thoughts that you have on taking the recommendations and putting them into a context that's understandable by the public, that can be actioned on, instead of, oftentimes we think of the audience as being the country. But how do we create a larger narrative around it so that we can textualize the information? Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for that question. Please.
Thank you so much. I just want to reinforce some points stated by the panelists. So first...
Sorry, could you quickly introduce yourself?
Oh, okay. My name is Mario Blanco from Colombia, the Colombian chapter. Thanks. It's not only accountability, but real impact. Impact in human rights, better nutrition for population, achieve better democratic governments. And I think we are really focused on the formal accomplishment of these commitments. But as civil society organizations, we think that we have to think further beyond to a real impact. And this is not reflected in the way we measure the accomplishment of the commitments. So I think we have to think in indicators, impact indicators that reflect changes in the society. How to measure that? I don't know. We have to think. But yeah, that's the first point. The second point is, what about the sustainability of these efforts? I think it's good to agree with the governments, some resources, human resources, financial resources, not just for the accomplishment, short-term accomplishment, but thinking in the long-term accomplishment and the real impact. Some topics or some articles of the conventions cannot be assessed in a short term. So we need resources for the long term. And it also shows the real will of the governments to accomplish and generate real impact. To be concrete, it should be a good idea to agree with the governments that, but we don't have to lose the focus in what we want. We don't fight against corruption just to fight. We need real changes in the society, and the international commitments are not focusing in that. We are thinking in the formal, but not in the real impact. That's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't see any other comments. Maybe as a last one, and then we go back to a final round of statements. Yeah. Okay. Two last ones, and then we close. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mihai Korman. I'm working for GIZ Moldova, where we have a quite comprehensive and broad anti-corruption project in the country. And by the way, GIZ also has a session tomorrow at 8:30 on how to win the kleptocratic war. So I really recommend everyone joining the session tomorrow at 8:30. And besides advertising for that, I also wanted to emphasize, and I think it's really, really important, the the actual significance of political will. I think one very clear example, I mean, someone mentioned the European Union, was the failure of the 2014 anti-corruption report, where we have seen that many EU member states have been very reticent towards the supranational level or the international level sort of interfering in their, as what they perceived, national sovereignty rights. And I think two things are important here. The first thing is, obviously, as a lawyer, I can say that criminal law, which is obviously very important in the area of anti-corruption, is in many countries national law. It's not been transferred onto the supranational level. So obviously that makes it more difficult for countries to give up criminal law as sort of part of their basic sovereignty rights to the supranational level. And I think most importantly is for countries to understand that anti-corruption is not something that you can solve on a national level. Corruption does not know any borders. What is important is a cross-border and international approach to sort of be able to prevent major frauds, such as some of you might be familiar with the $1 billion fraud in Moldova that happened in 2014. Was able to actually transcend national borders and even end up from Moldova via EU banks to offshore companies. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. Yes, please brief, final last comment or question, okay. And then we have a few minutes for our closing.
Good morning to everybody. I'm very happy to be here for this conference, this international conference. I'm from Côte d'Ivoire. My name is Traoré Bakary. One thing I have to say is you don't have civil society at the same thing anywhere. In the developing country, civil society are very strong. But in some part of Africa, civil society are still on building. We need to build civil society to be able to do what you are doing in the developing country. I think it's very important. And sometimes it's very difficult to identify who is really civil member of civil society or not. We have to take it in account when working with civil society in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that point. If there's any government who is struggling to find civil society in their country, please talk to us. We would be not trying. It's an important point that you're making, but I'm serious. If there's any government that is trying to identify independent NGOs working on anti-corruption, but is struggling with that, please come to us. We would be happy to connect you. But I would like to get back to our panelists for maybe a 1-minute closing statement each. I know we're running out of time, but maybe you can pick and choose your favorite points.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I would like to have much more time to address all the interventions, but I want to go back maybe to what Simon Taylor shared with us. I don't have the answer. I think that the more we can feed the follow-up mechanisms with concrete cases, the better the outcome of these follow-ups could result. Because when we are very theoretical and just looking at laws and institutions, that doesn't say much, and this is linked to what Mario was saying about the impact indicators. I think we need to introduce them, and in many cases, those impact indicators are related on specific cases. At the same time, this intervention makes me think again about what the gentleman from Uganda mentioned at the beginning. I don't think this is about, and this wasn't your point, but this is how I interpret it. This is not about civil society against government or government against civil society. In many cases, and this is one of the key lessons as well for us in Colombia, in our own civil society report elaboration, we interview a lot of public officials from the judiciary, from law enforcement agencies, and we find many people in government who are actually working very hard for the countries to achieve compliance with these conventions and commitments. So at the end, it's also looking, these follow-up mechanisms help us identifying and looking at the different opportunities that we have in this wider dialogue between civil society and governments, and finding opportunities and champions to push for reforms.
Thank you very much. Gillian, did you have last statements?
Yeah, I think I'm also going to focus on what Simon Taylor was telling us about, and I think one thing that highlights is the importance of bringing cases to these review mechanisms. The OECD Working Group on Bribery does have something that I think none of the other mechanisms have, which is there is a mechanism for addressing serious cases of non-compliance with the convention, and that's when they send, first of all, technical missions, and then they send high-level missions, which you know, when it's made, then they make it known that they're doing that, and it's embarrassing for the governments, and that has some effect. They've done that in Brazil, in Greece, and Turkey, I think. I think even though these forums are not as good as we'd like them to be, they do give an opportunity, just following on that, for addressing issues to a group of governments. And the governments are you know, subject to peer reviews, and they also care about what their peers think. So in terms of that, maybe not, but in terms of that issue, you know, that's a place where you can go, you can address letters, you can mobilize us all, because I think this is of interest to everyone here. And I personally think their report could have been a lot more critical. I know that I've talked to people who were involved in the case who were quite happy with it. They've been much more critical in other cases, other country reports. So they also conduct consultations. So I think we have to use every possible avenue in such situations to put pressure on the group of governments and the individual government. Thanks.
Thank you, Gillian. Corinna, maybe briefly a few points.
Yeah, just to say, I completely agree with the interventions about measuring the impact, and not just on corruption, combating corruption, but on human rights and other issues. And I would just say, please join the UNCAC coalition in our efforts to strengthen the IRM. We're going to be focusing on this, as Mathias said in the beginning, over the next couple years, where we could potentially get a follow-up mechanism to promote greater accountability. And so I would just encourage you all. The questions today have been great and have got us thinking a lot just up here on the stage. So please do join us. And there's a sign-up sheet out there where you can put your contact info. Thanks.
I also agree with the comments of my fellow panelists about the need to measure actual impact and actual outcomes on the lives of people when it comes to, sometimes it seems like we're talking about very technical issues, but actually this comes down to services and delivered to people and everyday lives of people. Just one thing I would like to emphasize is that I really wish that for the more governments to see civil society as partners. And if we look at the most famous scandals, corruption scandals that have been uncovered in the last years, be it Panama Papers or others, it has been done by brave investigative journalists and civil society, and not by law enforcement agencies who have more access to this kind of data. So governments really need to see civil societies as their partners and more like, and not as enemies.
Thank you very much, Tina Tin. I think we learned a lot of interesting aspects about review mechanisms, how we can make them work better. I would like to thank all of you for your questions and comments. If you're really interested in especially the UNCAC review mechanism and its success in the future and would like to collaborate with us or stay in the loop, please, as you leave, put your name up there on the list or through the QR code, fill out a form so we can keep you in the loop. As I said, this is going to be one of our priorities in the next year or two to get the future of the UNCAC review mechanism right. So if you're a government interested in this topic, talk to us, how we can collaborate on that. If you're civil society trying to become more involved in the UNCAC reviews, please also talk to us. We would be happy to see how we can support you in that. Thank you again for all the questions and comments. Thanks for joining us this morning, and have a fantastic and interesting rest of the day. And thank you to all the panelists. Thank you.